That's always a challenge, to learn a different business model, how the business makes money, what's the value chain, where can you add value. There's no wrong choice. I think the only mistake you can make is not making a choice. The one thing that I think you really do want to avoid, and this is a mistake I've seen a lot of people make in their careers, they're not learning, they're not growing. In those situations where you get reorganized out of a job, there's a layoff, you've got to make a change in career, maybe not by choice, a lot of those people feel stuck. So it taught me at a very early age and stage of career how to learn about a new business and how to establish credibility quickly with people who didn't know you, who many of whom had been in that business for a very long time.
Hi, I'm your host, Reena Suri, and welcome to Thriving Changes. In this episode, Ian Ziskin shares his 44-year journey through HR, leadership, and entrepreneurship, emphasizing the importance of intentional career choices, resilience, and learning from loss. You'll discover practical wisdom on career transitions, leadership development, and turning grief into growth. Let's dive in. Good morning, Ian.
Great to be with you, Reena.
Welcome to Thriving Changes. It's so good to have you, and I'm so grateful for your time and that you've taken it out from your busy schedule and fitted this in somewhere.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We had quite an interesting pre-call and lots of things to talk about: leadership and your career and the book that has been recently launched. How we do it is I normally invite my guests to share a little bit about themselves and give a little background, and then we take it from there.
Great. Yes, happy to do that. So I've been in the HR and leadership game now for almost 44 years. One of those good opportunities when you stumble into something that you absolutely love. Basically two separate but very related chunks to that career. The first 28 years I spent working in large companies, primarily in the HR profession. Toward the latter part of my corporate life, I was the chief HR officer for two different companies, most recently a company called Northrop Grumman in the aerospace and defense industry. I absolutely loved my corporate life and had a lot of fun and interesting experiences, maybe made a few mistakes, more than a few, along the way, and had a few random successes perhaps too that I've learned from. But as much as I loved my corporate life, I also had this entrepreneurial side of me which kept popping out. So almost about 16 years ago now, I launched my own coaching and consulting firm called Exec Excel Group, which has always been a portfolio business, fundamentally a combination of coaching, leadership development, a lot of boards and advisory board roles with more entrepreneurial kinds of companies, and then a few other random things thrown in along the way, including writing some books. That's where my life sits now. I'm at a place in life and career where I'm fortunate to be able to maybe slow down a little bit, or at least try to, and be a bit more selective about the things that I spend my time on. But one of those things is I love opportunities to speak on a podcast like this and share whatever I've learned with others to the degree that can be helpful. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to spend some time together today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I really get to learn so much more from your experience, and I enjoy these conversations because there's always those wisdom nuggets coming out and makes my day. I guess I want to start with, you mentioned you transitioned between quite a few industries. And this is a mindset that we did dwell on in our pre-call, and that's where I like to start. So I'm a coach myself, and I've often had conversations with my clients, or they've shared their experiences, especially when a client has been laid off and they've been referred to an outplacement service. And I've heard that they've been advised to stick within their industry or within their niche. And even though there can be possibilities for them to explore other industries given their skill sets. So I'd love to know your thoughts on it, because you're somebody who's done it so well.
Yeah, let's dive into it. First of all, I think the definition of expertise, I think, is probably can be defined in maybe two separate ways. One is I might be an expert if I've spent my entire career, 10, 20, 30 or more years in a particular industry, in a particular functional area that I know very well, that I'm very comfortable with. And that's a very legitimate way to develop and keep expertise. So I'm not criticizing it at all. I would just introduce maybe a different definition or another definition of expertise to anybody who's listening to us, because from where I sit, I also think it's an expertise to be able to quickly learn new businesses, new industries, new companies, and transition effectively from one place to another. I don't think one of those definitions of expertise is any better than the other. What I do think, however, is for anybody who's contemplating how to best manage their own career and control their own destiny to a certain degree, is to be somewhat thoughtful, somewhat intentional, somewhat planful about which path they want to take. Do they want to be known as a deep down expert in a particular industry, in a particular function, and run their entire career from that platform? And if so, there's advantages to doing that. But there's this other path, which is actually the path I chose. I made a very conscious decision very early in my career. As much as I loved each industry that I've worked in, the thing that really has turned me on probably the most is the variety and the challenge of moving from one place to another, learning new things, establishing credibility with a new group of people who might think about business and business problems in a different way. And each time you move from business unit to business unit within a large diversified company, which I have done, or each time you move from company to company in different industries, which I've also done, or in my coaching and consulting life these last 16 years, working with lots of different clients that cut across a very wide swath of different industries. That's always a challenge, to learn a different business model, how the business makes money, what's the value chain, where can you add value, and be able to speak the language of that business. That for me has been more enjoyable. That variety has been more enjoyable even than the deep down expertise that some of us like to build by staying in one industry. Final point, I think, is just to reemphasize for anybody who's listening that there's no wrong choice. I think the only mistake you can make is not making a choice and thinking about whether you want to be a deep down expert for the next 30 years or whether you want to be somebody who has a little bit more variety in their background and then follow a strategy that enables you to do that. The one thing that I think you really do want to avoid, and this is a mistake I've seen a lot of people make in their careers, a lot of people I've worked with proudly told me they have 30 years of experience, for example. But when you peel back the onion, what you recognize is what they really have is 1 year of experience 30 times. They've been doing almost exactly the same thing year after year, and they do feel like an expert because they can almost do what they're doing in their sleep, but they're not learning, they're not growing. And to the point you made earlier, if in those situations where you get reorganized out of a job, there's a layoff, you've got to make a change in career, maybe not by choice, a lot of those people feel stuck because they don't have the breadth of experience that's required in order to be an attractive, viable candidate for people in other types of organizations. And that can be a mistake that's hard to rectify in the moment. You have to manage that earlier in your career when you have options of making changes and moving from one type of organization to another.
Very interesting. You said that you were pretty intentional about this choice. And so was it a certain strategy? How did you, I mean, it's not just you, but the other person also needs to be open to exploring it, right? That somebody bringing in an individual from another industry and being open to what they bring. Was there a particular way that you positioned yourself or something that helped you make these transitions easily?
Yes, rightly or wrongly, this was a fairly conscious strategy that I had, believe it or not, from very early in my career coming out of graduate school. So there's a couple of examples I'll give you to try to respond to your question. One is literally when I was leaving grad school and looking for jobs that I was going to take out of finishing my master's degree in industrial and labor relations. The company that I went to work for, TRW, was a very decentralized, diversified company that was in a number of different businesses. They were in aerospace and defense, they were in automotive parts manufacturing, they were in other manufacturing and industrial kinds of businesses. They were also in a variety of different information services related businesses. And that really got my attention because I was feeling like I could stay with that company for a very long time, and I ended up staying with them for 18 and a half years. But within that period of time, I felt like I would have the opportunity, especially if I raised my hand and showed an interest, to move from one part of the company to another, where even though it said TRW on the door, all the other aspects of the business were completely different from one another. And I barely knew anybody as I was moving from one part of the company to another. So it taught me at a very early age and stage of career how to learn about a new business and how to establish credibility quickly with people who didn't know you, who many of whom had been in that business for a very long time. So that practice was actually very helpful. But I also think there was another aspect to this, which I alluded to briefly, and that is showing a willingness and a desire to do it, right? A number of opportunities came my way. I was very fortunate to have people who believed in me over the course of my career, who were willing to take a risk on me and invest in me. But what I also had to bring to the party was the craziness or the willingness to take some risks and try new things and maybe pick up and make some geographic moves, which I did quite a few times in my career, but certainly be comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable by moving into jobs that I was, by age and experience, frankly, quite often not ready for, and thinking about it in terms of my own development in addition to whatever contribution I was hoping to be able to make to that business, including going to some businesses that frankly were in a lot of trouble. I always found among my colleagues, there's a tendency, understandably, to go where the glamour is, the businesses that are growing and adding people and adding resources and all that. And I did my fair share of that, but I also did more than my fair share of going to businesses that were falling apart or in trouble, or the company was trying to figure out whether it wanted to stay in that business. And so part of it was a big turnaround effort where honestly, that's some of where the best learning comes from, is going to businesses that are a mess and trying to figure out how to make them something less than a mess. Some people avoid those kind of situations for whatever reasons. I always found them very intriguing and drawn toward them as opposed to running away from them. That turned out to be a fairly important part of my quote unquote strategy of building a more diversified experience portfolio.
There are two things that really caught my attention. One was this, that you did elaborate on how you intentionally chose businesses that were not doing well, and how that helped you develop some of the skills that developed your leadership and your future growth. And the other was that taking on positions that you were not ready for. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, some of this is good luck and fortune too, that people, especially early in my career when I was much younger, saw something in me maybe that I didn't see in myself, believed in me. And even though they felt like you might not have all the experience that you need, you're a reasonably intelligent person who's a hard worker, you'll figure it out. And so I believed them. I took their advice to say that you're not going to fail, or we're not going to let you fail. But even if you do, there'll be great learning that will come from that. So it got me comfortable pretty early with the idea of trying new things, seeing if you could figure it out. It also got me very comfortable with something else, which is surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than and better than you in a lot of areas that may or may not be your strength. So in my case, I was coming into businesses quite often where I hadn't grown up in that business, so I didn't fully understand the business. I was working with people who I didn't necessarily know, and they didn't know me. Many of those people, by definition, especially earlier in my career, were 10 or 20 or 30 years older than me, yet they were going to be working for me or with me as peers. And So one other thing that I had to get really comfortable with was asking questions and not pretending that I knew everything and trying to be a good listener and asking for help and advice, which I think over time probably made me a better leader, even in my more experienced stages of life, latter portion of my career. I still tried to be somebody who surrounded myself with good people and who listened and asked questions and took advice. And that habit of not acting like everything and trying to be the smartest person in the room was a habit that I developed very early in my career, but it served me very well even when I was more experienced than some of the other people in the room. I still benefited greatly from their perspective and wisdom and insight on things that, especially the things that I wasn't as experienced in. Anybody who's listening to this conversation, I would say, I don't care where you are in your career, whether you're in your 20s or your 50s or 60s or 70s, there's great benefit to be gained by recognizing you don't know everything and surround yourself with people who know more things than you do, at least in certain aspects, and allow them to do their job and encourage them to speak up, including when they disagree with you, not just when they agree with you. And generally, you'll make better decisions and be more effective as a result.
So many nuggets that you've just thrown out there. I've lost track. I stopped writing at one point of time. But what really stood out also to me was that people allowed you, gave you that space to make mistakes. And that was so cool, right? That you have those people around you who let you figure out, but they've also got your back if you make a mistake and let you experiment and figure it out. It's so good to have those people in your life who let you do that and are there to support you along the way.
Yes, I was very lucky again to be working for a lot of those kinds of people. At the same time, I've worked for enough different people over the course of my career, both in corporate life and even clients who I've worked with, that I feel like I've had the full spectrum of great people to work with and for, and lousy people to work with and for. And the one lesson learned for me or nugget of wisdom that came from that, no surprise, is it's a lot better to work for great bosses and with great people than to work for lousy bosses and with lousy people. And one thing I do see a lot is people feel or think that they're stuck. They spend time talking to me about, hey, my boss is a jerk, or the leadership team that I'm part of is not the kind of people that I really want to be working with and for. Yet they express that in the mindset of, and I'm stuck with that. And yes, I recognize people have mortgages to pay and families' mouths to feed, and there are responsibilities that you have to take into consideration, for sure. But I would also say that no one has more control over your own choices and destiny than you do. So if you're working for a boss who doesn't respect you or who doesn't listen or who doesn't treat you like you have something valuable and unique to offer, or if you're working with peers on a leadership team, for example, who are impossible to work with, hopefully that's not the case. But if it is the case, do something about it, because there are other places to work and other people to work with and for who are generally going to be better than what you might feel like you're stuck with. But all of us have to take a certain amount of initiative and risk to extract ourselves from those kinds of unpleasant environments and go find something that's better and more compatible with who we are and what our priorities are. Most of the time, someone's not going to pluck you out and save you. Occasionally that happens, but more often than not, each of us individually has to take the initiative to go find a better, more suitable fit. And so I've been in places where I was very lucky working for fantastic people. I've also been in places where I was misery working for somebody who is extremely difficult. And eventually you learn that you have to, to some degree, control your own destiny by taking some action to address that.
You've mentioned two, three times that has come up, the mistakes that you've made. What have been some of your greatest learnings through those mistakes?
Yeah, I think one big one I'll describe as you can't coach DNA. There are certain things that are fundamental to people and who they are as human beings that no matter how good you think you are in your job or how great the advice is that you're going to offer other people around you, if you're fundamentally dealing with certain people who are either unethical or don't believe in treating people with dignity and respect, that's extremely difficult to coach or change, especially the further along somebody is in their career and maybe even the more senior that they are in the role, because even with that counterproductive kind of behavior, certainly people do get promoted and they end up as CEOs or senior executives. And in some ways, they think that their behavior has been rewarded by all of those promotions, and maybe you're not going to change them. So I've made the mistake in my career of going into jobs, not often, but I've had this experience a couple of times where you genuinely believe that you really can help make somebody better. They're open and wanting to have you provide advice and counsel and support to make them better and a different kind of leader. But in reality, that's not really what they want. They want to be told how great they are, and they want to issue orders and have everybody around them, including you, listen and just execute. And that is absolutely not the right environment for me. Even now, in coaching and consulting kinds of engagements, which is a different relationship than working with a quote unquote boss, but I'm also very careful, or try to be careful, of working with people who really want my help, because there's certain people, for example, who hire a coach, but they do it for show. They're really not interested in improving as a leader or doing something different as much as they are reinforcing their own view of themselves and their own rightness. And those kinds of engagements, whether it's coaching or whether it's being a CHRO working inside of a company, or any other kind of leader working with other people, it's just much better to be in an environment where the people around you want to be the best they can be and want you to contribute to that by providing help and advice. You can't coach DNA, I think, is my summation of that point. The other one that I'll mention, because it's come up a few times over the course of my career as well, is this idea that the people who work for you, all with good communication and encouragement and coaching and development and advice and support, all will want to step up to the level of effort and performance that's required of them. And I have to be careful how I say this, because I'm a fundamental believer in the goodness of people. And as an HR person, I certainly am a fundamental believer in investing in people's development. But I've seen too many examples of other people, and this is a mistake I've made too, of over-investing in people, where you over-communicate and you over-coach and you over-develop and you over-support, and the person really doesn't have any desire, or in some cases ability, to be able to operate at the level of performance, effort, competence, et cetera, that the organization's really needing of them at that time. Even though they may be very well loved, they may be somebody who's been there a long time. In some cases, a lot of people may think very highly of them, and should, because they're great people in a variety of ways, but they might not really be able to step up. So I mention this only because I see a lot of leaders step into new roles and make the mistake of assuming now that they're there as the new leader, all these people are going to up their game, and hopefully most of them will. But for those people who don't wait too long to make a change, because usually, I've had this conversation with literally hundreds of leaders in my career. I've never heard a leader say, I regret moving too quickly on somebody who wasn't performing. I've heard a lot of leaders say, I regret waiting too long to move on somebody who wasn't performing, and that person who wasn't performing had a tendency to drag down the performance of the entire organization because they weren't pulling their weight or contributing equally. And give people a chance, by all means, but once you're feeling like you've doubled and tripled down on giving the person a chance and they're still not making any progress, you're probably right. They're probably not making any progress, and it's probably time to make a change.
I love the thought that you believe in the goodness of people and to take that chance. But yeah, you can't change the core DNA. And you'll rather have those people who are willing to invest in themselves and are willing to explore other perspectives and be on board with the new thought and leadership.
Yeah, and I probably should emphasize that at least in some of these cases, it's not malicious. It's just that the person is in the wrong place or the wrong role. They may be a great human being. I think you can fundamentally believe in the goodness of people
Yeah.
and at the same time make a change, because sometimes what happens is you're torturing the person and they won't admit it or they don't even know it. They're not performing at the level that they could be because the expectations of the organization are too different from what they can bring to the party. And in many cases, they would actually be much better off going someplace else.
Right.
That's a much better fit for them. Hopefully you do that with dignity and do it professionally, but also cause the person to go to a different environment where maybe they can really shine if they're not shining in the environment that they're currently in. And it's very difficult for most human beings to recognize that about themselves. So I actually think one of the big jobs of the leader, or even the HR person who may be helping support that leader, is to help that person recognize that they would be better off and more effective and maybe happier in a different environment than the one that they find themselves in.
I guess it's a great place also to segue into the other major transition of yours, which was from your corporate life to an entrepreneurial life. How did that shape up? Did you have a plan for it, or how did it happen?
Yeah, I did have a plan for it. It started more as a distant dream that maybe when I quote unquote retired from my corporate life when I was 65 or whatever the standard time might have been, I would dabble in coaching and consulting and see what that was all about. So that's how I thought about it for a long time. But as my career went along, I realized I had other options and ways of thinking about it. So again, I was pretty fortunate in terms of when I made the move to run my own business, I was 52. I had been around long enough to have been in some senior jobs and picked up some responsibilities as a CHRO that I guess in theory gave me some credibility with the people that I would be working with as a coach and consultant. Financially, to be honest, I was in a position of being able to do it maybe a little sooner than some other people might have been willing to take that risk. And I was at an age where I figured if I try this and I don't like it or I'm not any good at it, I'm still probably young enough that I could actually go back and be a CHRO at some point if that's what I wanted to do. So I packaged all those thoughts together and then kept allowing that entrepreneurial spirit in me to be popping out. And I kept thinking the same thing over and over again, which was, I really don't have any idea whether I'm going to be good at running my own business, particularly the business development side of things, right? Because whenever you're a coach or consultant, a big part of what you do is find new business. Didn't really know whether I'd be good at that because that muscle had never really been developed in me. My corporate life, every day when I showed up at work, even if on the rare occasion where I didn't have any meetings scheduled that day, which was pretty rare, I figured if I sat in my office for 10 or 15 minutes, somebody would find me with some disaster that needed to be addressed. And in the consulting and coaching universe, that's really not how it works. If you don't call somebody or reach out to somebody or send them an email or go meet with them, they don't even know you're there, let alone to find you to solve a problem. So I had no idea if I would be good at that business development stuff, but I concluded there was only one way to find out, which was to try it. And so I finally said, okay, this is the time to leap in and I'm going to give it a try. So that was a big transition for me to get comfortable with and learn how to do the business development rhythm that would lead to a viable, thriving coaching and consulting business. And also recognizing that that whole infrastructure of all of those people, literally thousands of people who worked for me in my corporate life, and all of the support services that you get working in a big company, all of a sudden are gone. And it's really all about you and what you do or don't do, right? Every day is a set of choices of how you're going to spend your time. And that was a fascinating learning experience from day one started. And you make a lot of adjustments and mistakes and learn a few things along the way. But that whole learning process was a fascinating transition for me.
Did you take support of a mentor or a coach at that time, or just figured it out on your own?
Well, kind of in between. I didn't really have a formal mentor or coach, honestly, but what I did do was I had quite a few people who I knew who were in coaches and consultants and various people in my network who I spoke to and
Mm,
got lots of advice about
yeah.
things that they had done in running their business and approaches that they had taken in terms of prioritization and what was in their portfolio and that sort of thing. And so I listened a lot. I observed what other people were doing in the quote unquote competitive space that I was in. And then I came up with my own game plan and then just went out there and started reaching out to people. One thing that had helped me a lot, I probably wasn't smart enough to know this at the time, but because I was reasonably well networked as a
Mm.
CHRO with a number of other senior leaders in other companies, those relationships helped a lot, especially in the early years of building my business because I knew them and they knew me, and many of them sent business my way or referred me to other people that they had in their networks who they believed that maybe I could help. And that was a lot better than starting from scratch where you know no one and have no relationships whatsoever as you're trying to build your business. Now, obviously, 16 years later, I know a lot more and a lot different set of people than where I started 16 years ago. But having that foundation was very helpful early on.
It's so important to have that to build a business, because otherwise you won't really have a business if you don't have that network of people who can refer you and or they come to you. I know that Excel is one, and then there's Consortium of Change as well, right? So are there two businesses or it's one?
Well, the Consortium for Change is a little bit of a unique animal in that it's not a business per se. It's actually a network community of independent coaches and consultants. Back in 2018, a colleague and friend of mine named Lacey Leone McLaughlin and I co-founded this group, the Consortium for Change, or C4C for short. Basically, now, many years later, it's got about a little over 50 independent coaches and consultants in the group. These are all people who run their own successful businesses, mostly in coaching, leadership development, talent management, transformational change, team effectiveness, strategy, innovation, mostly things on the people side of the equation in coaching or consulting. But the fundamental premise is basically to be able to scale up for larger projects because as a solo entrepreneur running your own business, it's sometimes harder to compete against mid-size and larger coaching and consulting firms. There's also a lot of referral of business back and forth between people, which has been very effective, I think. And then the final main reason for establishing the group, which has probably grown to be the most beneficial aspect, I think, is simply the community aspect of sharing practices, learning from one another, swapping stories, because sometimes being a coach or consultant when you run your own business can be a little bit lonely. So all of those things have played out over the years. But what it's really taught me is the value of creating something where people volunteer their time and give back to something that's greater than themselves because they also feel like they're benefiting and learning from other people who are part of the group and creating a lot of trust between people who didn't previously know one another. That's actually been very gratifying, to be honest.
You mentioned that you started writing pretty early in your life. Career, was it life or career? Did you start in school or college, or was it during your corporate life that you started writing?
Well, I think I discovered that I enjoyed writing as a student, various courses that I was taking where that kind of clicked with me. It just made me take notice of the fact that it was something I enjoyed. But I think where it became more organized was in my professional life. So I had the opportunity to write a couple of articles early on when I was in my mid to late 20s That was a little bit of a kick, getting something published that you were able to write about whatever the topic was, generally speaking, HR, leadership related. But I always had in the back of my mind, opening my own coaching and consulting firm, I had in the back of my mind, maybe I have a book in me. And so I started writing a book actually toward the latter part of my corporate life as I was getting ready to launch my coaching and consulting business. And that turned out to be a pretty good strategy, because that book was a little bit of a credibility builder and gave you something to talk about with clients and prospective clients. And it led to coaching engagements, and it led to speaking engagements, and that sort of thing. Became a bit of a calling card. That was my first of now 5 books, but it was a creative outlet, which I enjoyed. It was an opportunity to give back to the profession, which I also enjoyed. And then it was also a way to establish yourself with clients and prospective clients. So it was good from a business development point of view as well.
Yeah. Which one was that? What was the name of that one? The first one?
The first one was called Will Be.
Okay.
Subtitle is 13 Reasons Will Be's Are Luckier Than Wannabes.
Wannabes.
Yeah, and basically the premise of the book was leadership principles for early career leaders, people who are learning how to be leaders at the very early part of their career. I focused on 13 things, actually, that some of the better up and coming leaders tended to display relative to everybody else. Not surprisingly, some of the things that you would find in that book are many of the things that we've been talking about during this conversation.
So interesting. And your latest one is Lives Lost and Leadership Found.
Yes, Lives Lost and Leadership Found, Lessons from Special Somebody. So that's also a leadership book, but with a very different twist and emphasis to it. We can discuss if you like.
Yeah. So how did that book happen?
Yeah, so first, the premise of the book may be important for people who are listening, is life and leadership lessons learned from lost loved ones. So think about, for anybody who's listening to us, a key person that you might have in your life or have had in your life. Might have been a parent, a grandparent, a relative of some kind, sibling, cousin, could be a friend, could be a boss, former boss, mentor, somebody like that, who's had a significant influence for you about life lessons and leadership lessons, but who maybe has passed away. And in my particular case, the launch point for the book, going back to 2023, was that my brother, younger brother, who was 60 at the time, and then my mother both passed away about 6 months apart from each other. My brother's case was diagnosed with what they at first thought was a stroke, but very quickly realized he had some brain tumors which had metastasized throughout his body. And very quick process from diagnosis to death of about 8 days. And then about 6 months later, my mother passing away at 93 would not be a big shock. But what I like to say is that she was fine right up until the time she wasn't. She was in pretty good shape for somebody who was 93, but it started experiencing these severe stomach pains, went to the hospital. Within 4 or 5 hours, cardiac arrest. Her body had basically just shut down from all the stress of what she was experiencing. Both of these things were pretty sudden in their own way. And of course, plenty of people in the world have lost loved ones. What it made me almost immediately start thinking about was, what did I learn from both of them, both in life and in their deaths? Did it change me as a person? Did it make me somehow a better leader as a result of things that I learned from them? And almost quickly after that, I started reaching out to other people in my network, thinking I can't be the only person who's ever gone through a loss like this and tried to process the loss in the context of lessons learned. As I reached out to people in my network, I was asking them, do you have somebody, in your life who you've lost, who you feel like you could write about? And got a very positive response. So the book emerged from all of that thought process. And in addition, as the lead author, the contributions that I've made to the book, there are 35 essays in the book by contributing authors who are telling stories about significant people in their lives, special somebodies, as we call them in the book, and the life and leadership lessons that they've learned. So it was really a fascinating project to work on collaboratively with a very large group of other people.
Yeah. First of all, I'm so sorry for your loss. And how you said 2023, you lost your brother, right? It's
Yeah, and yeah, both in the same year. So obviously it's been a little bit now, but at the time that was going on, it took me probably, I'm going to say the first couple of months, 2 or 3 months into 2024 before I was probably thinking clearly enough to say, I wonder if this could and should be a book, which then led me to reach out to some of the other folks in my network, which took a little bit of time. But once we came to realization that we had a book in us somehow that we felt other people could benefit from, that was a fairly quick process. So by the time we talked to the publisher who I'd worked with previously, they were very amenable to picking up the book and working with us. It was a little under a year in terms of getting the book out and about, and it came out in October of 2025, so it's still relatively new by book standards.
yeah. Take me back to some of your learnings from loss.
I think one of the things that really stuck with me, particularly this was from my mother, a big life lesson, was advocacy, right? One of the things I talk about in the book is that her superpower was being an advocate for others. And I chuckle in the sense that she was an advocate for other people, whether or not they knew they needed an advocate, wanted an advocate. She just felt it was her obligation to stand up for other people. But it did teach me a lot about the importance of standing up for yourself and advocating for yourself. I don't mean in a selfish way. I just mean there's a right way in life, and you should treat people with respect, and you should fight for what you believe in and push back against the things that you think are wrong in society and life. And she taught me a lot about that. Both she and my brother, partly because they didn't always deal with this all that well. One of the other things that really stood out for me, which is a big emphasis in my life, is face reality and deal with it. I think a lot of people, human beings I've discovered, have this almost limitless capacity to deny, deflect, dismiss facts or data that do not reinforce their preferred view of the internal or the external environment that they happen to be in. And people are pretty good at denial. And I think denial is kind of a fundamental poison in society as well as in organizations that are trying to change. I mean, your whole emphasis on thriving changes, right? I think one of the big obstacles to people and organizations successfully working their way through change is they don't face the truth, what's happening around them as people or organizationally. If you're not competitive or you need to make some changes in order to be more competitive in the future, I think denial really gets in the way of attacking, embracing what you have to achieve. Those kind of values, as I sat through and was reflecting on life with my mother and my brother, that really stuck with me, right? And what I started thinking was, I'm pretty sure, at least I have a hypothesis, that there's other people out there in the world who've learned something valuable from people that they've lost, but maybe never actually sat down and processed it in a way or write it down in a way that would benefit others around them. And that's really why we wrote the book.
I think you are one of those unique people that I've come across who've spun around so fast. Like, I'm sure you must have grieved, and it's a loss that is probably still very close to your heart. But you've also jumped back. That's resilience, right? There's something to do with neuroscience out there. What's the connection that you see here? How did you do it? It was barely 2023, and yes, you said 2024 is you took about a year to come to terms with it. Normally, a typical cycle for grieving is about 1 to 3 years, that people say that it takes about that much time, depending from person to person. So you were on the lower end of that spectrum, if we take 1 to 3 years. And within the next year, you had a book out on it. So I'm like quite fascinated with that journey. It's not a usual.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but first of all, a lot of people would say, including me, that I'm an impatient person, right? So getting on with things and moving quickly, I suppose, is part of who I am. Again, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I do think it's consistent with who I am. But the other thing which was consistent with who I am, which actually turned out to be one of the biggest learnings for me in the book, is the importance of intentionality. That common expression, people say time heals all wounds. I kind of believed that until I wrote this book. Now I really don't believe that anymore. I think time helps, but what I really think is that intentionality heals wounds. You actually have to go through a process of intentionally thinking through the loss, trying to process it, recognizing everybody grieves differently and they all grieve on a different timeline. Your point about 1 to 3 years, there's probably people who do it in less and people who take a lot longer as well. And that all should be respected. But what I also think is that people who seem to process loss of any kind, not just loss of a loved one, but anything traumatic or difficult, they seem to do better at it if they're intentional in their thought process. And part of being intentional, which is the part where the book comes in, is how are you going to take lemons and turn them into lemonade? How will you take something that's negative experience for sure and try to get something positive out of it for yourself or for other people or both in terms of learning or honoring the person who you're writing about? That's probably something that came to me very early in my life, because we haven't talked about this yet, but my father passed away when I was 13. He died just before his 47th birthday. And I remember even then, at that age, thinking this is a big deal. There's a lot of different directions to go. One direction is you can feel sorry for yourself, use the passing away of a parent as an excuse for behaving poorly or not doing well in school or whatever other excuse you might want to make. Or you can, yes, it's terrible, but learn from the experience, benefit, grow up fast, try to be a better human being, try to represent father's memory by being a better human being. And other people probably will judge much better than I could judge whether I was successful at that. But I do know it was very intentional, conscious on my part to think about it in those terms and make a conscious turn toward try to be the best person you could be and try to get something positive out of it and try not to drive off a cliff because you're miserable and upset or feeling sorry for yourself. I make no judgments about how other people process grief, but in my particular case, that was the most productive, I guess you could say, way of processing grief for me. And many years later, I think that whole philosophy translated into, yes, my brother and mother passed away and that was terrible, but I'm going to turn it into something positive by sharing what I learned, what all these other people who contributed to the book have learned, and honoring those individuals as well as sharing something about life and leadership. That's just fundamental to who I am.
No, I think it has paid off so well. And I think it's all about intentionality. You chose a certain mindset that that's going to define you. It was a very intentional decision, even at that age, at 13. You're still young. That's a next level maturity that you showed at such a young age. And it's probably the environment that you grew up, whether it was the influence of your mom or other people in your life, but the support system that you had at that time. Kids need that, especially when they're going through loss. And you chose to honor your dad and honor other relationships. And it is reflective in everything that you've said till now, even in your leadership, your choice to just look at the goodness of people, the choice to stick with surrounding yourself with people who will build you up, to who will edify you. Those are choices, and they've come from that. It's a common thread that I see in our entire conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. I guess if I had to describe myself, I'd say I'm a chooser. I'm somebody who tries to look at different alternatives and things and then make a conscious, intentional choice. Has every choice I've ever made in my life been the right one? No, I'm certainly not arrogant enough to say that I'm always right. But what I do think is true is that I do choose, right? I rarely sit back and just let time wash over me and hope that something good happens. Like my point earlier about the expression, time heals all wounds. I think you could be spending a lot of time waiting to feel better, but taking no conscious, thoughtful steps to feel
Yeah.
better as part of processing grief, and then wake up a year, two, three, 10 or 20 years later and find, yeah, I don't really feel all that good because you didn't do much else other than, wait for time to wash over you. And again, I make no judgments about how other people process grief and loss. I think we all have to get to where we get to in our own way that makes sense for us. I just know that the way that was maybe best
For
for me, or believe that what was best for me, was make some conscious choices, be intentional about it, and try to take something negative and turn it into a positive.
positive.
If you can do that in all aspects of life, not just in losing somebody close to you, I think you come out of a better, more contributing member of society if you do those things.
So I lost somebody who was very dear to me, very close, and we shared a bond. I think it's been now almost 10 years, but 9 years. I'm at a good place with it. But to your point, I had to intentionally choose, and I chose that pretty early. And I remember I was just pushing myself that no, I need to get up and do something. It was forced. But then I intentionally chose to allow myself to grieve, that it's
Mm-hmm.
okay. Why am I guess, skipping a step and trying to do something which will come after I go through this process? And I'm trying to jump through a step and do something and move on in life when I've not really done what I'm supposed to do. And it was an intentional, and remember, it was a permission that I gave to myself that it's okay to grieve, whatever it looks like, whether it's bowling into your pillow or just lying and doing nothing, or whatever it is that makes sense to me at that time. And I remember for 2 3 days I went through that, whether if I didn't feel like working, I didn't work. I took a day off. If I just wanted to lie in bed because I felt heavy, I allowed myself to do that. But then the recovery was so much faster, and everything that I was pushing myself to do started coming naturally. That, all right, I need to do something that will make me happy, something that will honor her memory, doing something that she enjoyed. I didn't have to force myself to do that anymore. It was an intentional choice, even to grieve.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully stated. And it also reinforces what we've been talking about, that everybody has their own way of grieving and processing
Yeah.
grief, and as long as somebody can be thoughtful about what's going to help them process
Mm.
the grief,
Yeah.
whether it's write a book or take a couple of days off or sit on the couch and just think about the person, everybody has their own way of doing it. But choosing what way is going to work for each of us, I think that's where the power is.
Is. And yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that a number of authors have contributed, right, in this book. And so how was that process?
Well, let's see. The less kind way of describing it it was like herding cats, but the more kind way is the collaboration was just phenomenal in a couple of ways. All of these people who contributed to the book in one way or another were either close or slightly extended members of my network and community. So people that I've had relationships with in many cases for a long time. And part of what fascinated me was these stories that people had to tell about various special somebodies that they were writing about. I had no idea. And so one of the things you take away from this, if you're me, is people are carrying around stuff that most of us have no idea what they're carrying around. Related to that was that some people wrote about people who'd passed away fairly recently, meaning in a matter of months, or like in my case, within a year or two of the person's death is when the book came out. Yet other people contributed in writing about somebody close to them from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or more years ago. Yet the level of emotion and catharsis for the person writing about this special somebody was exactly the same, irrespective of whether the person had passed away recently or a very long time ago. And then the third thing, which is related to the first two, is that I think I completely underestimated the value to the contributing author of writing an essay. And I think they underestimated it too, because so many of them came to me as they were doing it or after they completed the essay, talking about the emotional release and the catharsis, not only for them, but in some cases for family members or friends who they involved in the process or shared a draft of the essay with, to get people's reactions and people crying and reminiscing about this lost loved one, including, as I said, people who had passed away a long time ago. One of the outcomes of the book that wasn't even intended as part of the book is, for anybody who reads it, they'll see there's an appendix at the end of the book which encourages them and provides guidance on writing their own essay, even if they do it just for themselves and don't share it with anybody else, and certainly may not have an interest in getting it published in a book. But we're also doing actually an essay contest right now as part of the book that we've been posting on social media and the like, encouraging people to submit their essays to us, not because we're going to write another book, but because we're interested in seeing what other people have to say about the topic. And we'll have some prizes for people who turn in those essays as well, all stemming from the fact that it became this cathartic, emotional release kind of experience for people in writing about a lost loved one that I have to say, as the lead author, I completely underestimated the power of that as part of this process. So that was really eye-opening.
You also mentioned this. What are some tensions of intentionality that you mentioned? We were speaking of that, but is it related or?
Yeah, it definitely is. So as I mentioned before, this whole idea of intentionality really became an important principle for me in the book. I also talk about, there's 7 different tensions that I go through. I'll just mention a couple here for the sake of example time. One thing that really got my attention on this woman, Giselle Ibarra, who's a social media influencer, talks about this concept of life as a paradox. In order to heal, you must hurt, right? And I think that came through loud and clear in terms of all the things we learned from this book. And you kind of have to work your way through a series of these paradoxes or tensions in order to go from hurting to healing eventually. One example of that for me was the tension of moving from fog to clarity, right? So most people will tell you, including a lot of neuroscientists, that in the early months and even years of experiencing loss, as you well know, people have this brain fog experience that they go through. I certainly experienced that. I tell the story often of when my mother called to say that my brother was going to the hospital with what they thought was a stroke at the time. My first reaction was I got to jump on a plane and fly from New York to Atlanta, where both my mother and brother lived. And to this day, I don't remember anything about driving to the airport, getting on the airplane, getting off the airplane, driving to the hospital to pick up my mother. The first memory I have is actually seeing my mother at the hospital when I finally arrived. It was one of the reasons why I waited a few months at least before writing the book, because I actually felt if I tried to do it earlier, I probably wouldn't have been brain clear enough to be able to put something coherent together. So eventually you move from fog to clarity. You have to give yourself the time and the process of letting that brain fog begin to clear. Another example, just for one more, is the idea of compartmentalization to integration. So a lot of people who talk about processing grief and dealing with loss will talk about their ability to compartmentalize things, where you've got obviously the pain of losing somebody important to you, that takes over in a lot of ways. However, you also typically will have a job or family responsibilities or other things that are going on in your life where you have to keep soldiering on at the same time that you're dealing with this pain of this loss. And the ability to compartmentalize and put each of those things in its own little box, particularly the pain from loss, is actually an important skill. However, that doesn't last forever. Eventually, you have to integrate back together all these different aspects of your life. And if you try to compartmentalize the pain too long, it actually starts to drag you down. So you have to go again through this tension of moving from one to the other, from compartmentalization to integration. And there are a number of other, I think, process steps that most people typically go through, mostly unconsciously, that they have to work their way through as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. How do you look back at it all? Your journey, your 40 plus years in the industry, and your business entrepreneurship, and now life after experiencing loss.
Yeah, I consider myself to be a very fortunate person in that very early in life and career, I stumbled into a career of HR and then eventually also focusing on leadership aspects of things that I've absolutely loved, passionate about. I spend a lot of time with people in my life and career who don't like what they do for a living and are miserable in a way. And I feel badly for them, but I haven't experienced that. I look back on that. I'm quite fortunate. I'm also quite fortunate. I've been married to the same woman for almost 44 years. I have 3 great adult children, 2 daughters-in-law who we love, 2 grandchildren who we love. And I feel as difficult as it always is to somehow blend together the competing priorities of family and family demands and career demands. I've been surrounded by a family that's enabled me to do what I love career-wise. At the same time, we're all on speaking terms and we have a great relationship with each other. When I look back on those 2 big aspects of my life, I couldn't be any more happy or satisfied to be able to be in that kind of position, especially when we all look around us and realize that there are plenty of other people who don't have that same benefit and aren't living that same kind of high quality life. And you want to do everything you can to help them. But for me, I couldn't have asked for anything more.
So wonderful. What's next on your agenda? What's something that you're envisioning or something big coming up?
Yeah, so something big coming up that's very immediate. People who are listening to us, by the time they hear this recording, this may be slightly old news, but we're in the middle of a snowstorm in the Northeast, in the New York area where I live. And later this week, I'm planning on going to Florida for about 3 weeks and South Carolina for about 2 weeks and finding some sunshine and some warmth. And that's what's up next for me, because I'm at a point now in my life where, as much as I love what I do, I'm trying to slow down a little bit, let go of certain things that I've been involved in historically, say no to a few more things in order to make time, especially to be with family, my kids and my grandkids, and also to travel and spend some time in places that I enjoy spending time. So that's big up on the agenda for me, is to go find some warmth and sunshine.
Sounds fun and perfect where you are right now. My last question: what would be an advice or a thought that you would give to somebody who's just recently experienced a loss?
Yeah, I think while I'm reluctant to try to assume that everybody grieves the same way, as I've said, I think the best piece of advice I could offer anybody who's gone through a loss is spend a lot of time thinking about the person who you lost and what they taught you. Because while the person may no longer be here with us, the lessons that they've taught will actually always be here if we're willing to think about them, process them, remember them, honor them, and then hopefully incorporate some of those things into the daily conduct of our lives. And even if you happen to be in an unfortunate situation where you lost somebody who's close to you and you didn't have the best relationship with them, or they weren't perfect, they might have taught you something, positive or negative, about how to conduct your own life or how to lead other people, that with a little bit of thought and processing a nugget will appear that you can actually apply to running the rest of your life. That would be a good way to honor them, but also more importantly, a good way to honor yourself. That would be my advice.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. This has been so wonderful, and thank you for your time. And I'm so grateful.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me, and look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.